Kaplan, Deputy Editor at SC Magazine. I'm sitting with Chris Mark, who is the EVP of Data Security and Compliance at ProPay, which is a payment solutions provider. And today we're talking about ACH fraud, commonly happening now to a lot of small businesses, and it's ending up in businesses, in some cases, being out hundreds of thousands of dollars. So a serious problem. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us, define exactly what ACH is and what kind of fraud is coming out of it.
So in the most basic sense, ACH is a mechanism for transferring data back and forth or funds back and forth, and it's both debits and credits. So if you think about initiating a check through your bank, that technically is an ACH transfer. If you pay for a gym membership with a monthly recurring debit of your bank account, that's an ACH transfer. And there are lots of other things that they do with it, payroll, social security payments, but in a nutshell, that kind of.
So there's some businesses that use it less, maybe once every couple of weeks for direct deposit, payroll deposit. Some, like you mentioned, gyms who will use it quite frequently.
Absolutely.
The bad guys have caught on to this. Tell me what they're doing.
Yeah, so the bad guys, what we're seeing on the fraud side is they're actually using a variation of social engineering. So they're sending out, in a typical example, they'll send a spear phishing attack to somebody in the finance department, and it will oftentimes masquerade as, say, a Microsoft update or something that's important, and that person, not necessarily doing anything malicious, thinks it's a legitimate email, clicks on the link, it takes them to a malicious website, and it downloads, obviously, malicious software. The software typically includes a couple of components, one of which is a keystroke logger, and oftentimes a screen scraping Trojan. So when that person then, maybe in finance, goes to log in to initiate an ACH payment, it captures the login credentials. The criminals can then use that to log into that account and initiate payments to third-party, what they call mules, independent third parties. The FBI reported that a lot of these mules are actually being recruited from job boards. Now in this economy, you see a lot of organizations saying, hey, work from home and make $1 million a year, and when you go to apply for the job, they simply ask you for your bank account and routing number, and inadvertently you're being recruited as a mule.
And a lot of times they have no idea that they're working for a criminal organization.
That's right, they have no idea.
So, and with the businesses, so this malware is getting on their machines, and it's being used to what? To steal their credentials as they log into their ACH accounts?
That's right. It's being used to steal the username and login credentials for those ACH accounts, which the criminals then use to masquerade as that user, log in and initiate payments to third parties.
Right. So the problem seems to be authentication here, because if they only need a username and password to get in, that's something that they can easily steal by getting this malware onto the computers, right?
Absolutely. So, clearly when we're talking about initiating an ACH payment through either a third party or a bank, authentication is critical, making sure that the company is in compliance with the FFIEC regulations. It requires true multi-factor authentication. If all you require is a username and password, and I can steal or guess that, it becomes very easy for me to compromise the account. If I require that second factor of authentication, it increases the complexity exponentially.
So, and if I understand correctly, a lot of this, it's difficult to fight this malware because this stuff is custom built and it's very difficult to detect. So you almost have to, it's hard maybe for some businesses to hear this, but you almost have to accept that you might that you're going to get infected, and you need to have these authentication controls in place?
Absolutely. I think for any company that thinks that simple antivirus or malicious software controls are sufficient to prevent infection, I think that's a fairly, and I hate to say naive, but naive position. Studies have shown that upwards of 75% of PCs are infected with malicious software. Unfortunately, the way that the malicious software detection works is it's very reactive. Once we have a signature, we know what to look for, but until that signature is defined, the system can stay infected for years. The Synology Trojan is a good example. It stayed undetected for nearly 3 years until an RSA researcher by the name of Don Jackson identified it. I think to date they estimate that it's stolen almost 1 million accounts from people.
Mm-hmm. What should these are small and mid-sized businesses. They're not in the business of security. They're in the business of selling pizzas, teaching people how to run on the treadmill, with the gym reference. But so shouldn't the banks be responsible? Shouldn't is there like an ACH provider? Shouldn't they be?
So their banks are regulated obviously under they have to comply with the FFIEC regulations. The FFIEC does say that banks need to enforce multi-factor authentication. What we believe is happening from some of these smaller companies is they're using third-party ACH initiators or providers that may not be regulated under the same regulations. And so it certainly seems that most of these that are being compromised are only requiring a single factor of authentication, username in conjunction with a password. So I would say the most important thing for companies to do is ensure that you've got robust authentication in place, true multi-factor, and to kind of recap, 3 factors of authentication: something you have, a token, for example, something you know, a password, or something you are, a fingerprint, for example. 2 of those 3 factors increases the complexity exponentially.
And let's not, forget having the AV is still important, and probably training
Absolutely.
the users not to click on some of these malicious links is also
Absolutely. I mean, you can't just look at a single approach to security. It's got to be the layered, multi-tiered approach. Absolutely.
But these businesses are getting hit. The FBI estimates some 250. They're investigating some 250 cases of this ACH fraud right now. So surely this is going to be a trend that's going to continue, I would imagine.
I think as we're beginning to see people lock down credit card data, the criminals, being relatively savvy, are simply focusing their efforts on other low-hanging fruit. And right now it seems like ACH data is that low-hanging fruit.
Okay. Chris Mark from ProPay, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate the insight into this certainly emerging topic.
Thank you, Dan.
Absolutely.